Picture this. You're 72 years old, standing in the middle of Tokyo's busiest train station, holding a map upside down, wearing a fanny pack that screams tourist, and suddenly realizing you've been asking for directions to the bathroom in what you thought was Japanese but was actually just gibberish you made up. Sound familiar? Well, buckle up, because today we're diving into the absolutely hilarious world of senior travel fails that will have you laughing until your sides hurt. I'm talking about real stories from real people who've lived long enough to know better but still managed to create comedy gold during their adventures. These aren't just any travel mishaps. These are the kind of stories that get retold at family dinners for decades, the ones that prove age brings wisdom but definitely not immunity to spectacular vacation blunders. Why should you stick around for the next 11 minutes? Because by the end of this video, you'll have heard stories so outrageous, they'll make your worst travel experiences look like minor inconveniences. Plus, I guarantee you'll pick up some valuable lessons about what not to do on your next trip, all while getting the best belly laughs you've had all week. Let's start with Margaret from Phoenix, who at 75 decided she was ready to conquer Europe solo. Margaret had planned everything meticulously: flights, hotels, museum passes, the works. What she hadn't planned for was her complete inability to distinguish between different European currencies. For her entire 2-week trip through 5 countries, Margaret was convinced that all European money was basically the same thing. The result? She spent 3 days in Switzerland thinking everything was incredibly cheap, tipping restaurant servers the equivalent of $200 because she thought she was being generous with what looked like pocket change. Meanwhile, in Italy, she nearly started an international incident when she tried to pay for a €40 dinner with what she calculated as the correct amount, except she was using British pounds and insisted the exchange rate was 1-to-1 because, in her words, it's all European money, isn't it? The kicker? Margaret only realized her mistake when she got home, and her bank statement showed she'd somehow spent more money on tips than on hotels during her entire trip. Her response when her daughter pointed this out: "Well, I certainly made a lot of Europeans very happy, but Margaret's currency confusion is nothing compared to Harold's GPS adventure in Ireland." Harold, a retired engineer from Michigan, prided himself on being technologically savvy. He'd researched the best GPS apps, downloaded offline maps, and even bought a car charger specifically for his Irish road trip. What Harold hadn't researched was the difference between kilometers and miles, or the fact that Irish country roads from the 1800s weren't exactly designed with modern cars in mind. Following his GPS religiously, Harold found himself driving his rental car down what he later described as a path that goats would consider challenging. The GPS kept cheerfully announcing "continue straight," while Harold's car scraped against stone walls on both sides. Sheep scattered in panic, and he slowly realized he was essentially four-wheeling through someone's backyard in what was definitely not a four-wheel drive vehicle. The situation reached peak absurdity when Harold, committed to trusting technology over his own eyes, continued following the GPS directions, even as his path narrowed to barely wider than his car. He finally stopped when he reached a wooden gate with a sign that, even with his limited Irish, he was pretty sure meant private property, absolutely no cars allowed. The rescue operation involved 3 local farmers, a tractor, and Harold's car being pulled backwards for nearly half a mile because there was literally no room to turn around. The farmers, apparently used to GPS-confused tourists, were remarkably good-natured about the whole thing and even invited Harold for tea afterward, where they explained that his chosen route was actually a medieval walking path that hadn't seen vehicle traffic since approximately never. Harold's response? He bought a paper map for the rest of his trip and framed a photo of his car being tractor rescued as a reminder of his greatest navigational achievement. Now, if you think technology fails are embarrassing, wait until you hear about Dorothy's language barrier disaster in Paris. Dorothy, a retired French teacher from Ohio, was absolutely convinced she was fluent in French after 30 years of teaching high school students. She'd practiced her pronunciation, memorized key phrases, and was determined to navigate Paris speaking only French to get the authentic experience. The problems started immediately. Dorothy's first attempt at ordering coffee resulted in her accidentally asking the barista if she could marry his croissant. Her attempt to ask for directions to the Louvre somehow turned into a detailed inquiry about whether the stranger had seen her missing pet elephant. And her effort to compliment a street musician's performance came out as an enthusiastic declaration that his music made her want to dance with vegetables. The peak of Dorothy's linguistic adventures came when she got lost and decided to ask a police officer for help. Drawing on her decades of French teaching experience, Dorothy launched into what she thought was a perfectly constructed explanation of her situation. She gestured dramatically, used what she believed were proper conjugations, and even threw in some subjunctive clauses she was particularly proud of. The officer listened patiently for about 2 minutes before gently responding in perfect English. "Ma'am, I appreciate the effort, but you've been speaking Spanish for the last 5 minutes, and not very good Spanish at that." Dorothy had somehow defaulted to her high school Spanish, which was rusty enough to begin with, and had been confidently butchering 2 languages simultaneously while convinced she was impressing everyone with her French fluency. The officer, who turned out to be incredibly kind, not only gave her directions, but also walked her part of the way to make sure she didn't get lost again. Dorothy spent the rest of her Paris trip carrying a translation app and a healthy dose of humility about her language skills. Speaking of getting lost, let's talk about Robert's adventure with European hotel elevators. Robert, from Kansas, had never encountered anything more complex than a standard American elevator with numbered buttons and maybe a basement level. European hotels, with their ground floors, mezzanines, and numbering systems that start from 0, might as well have been rocket ships. Robert checked into his Amsterdam hotel and was told his room was on the 2nd floor. Simple enough, right? Wrong. Robert spent 45 minutes riding the elevator, pressing every button multiple times, and growing increasingly frustrated as he couldn't find his room number anywhere on what he assumed was the 2nd floor. He even went back to the lobby 3 times to complain that the hotel had given him a room number that didn't exist. The situation escalated when Robert, convinced the elevator was broken, decided to take the stairs and count floors manually. This led to him wandering hotel hallways for over an hour, trying his key card on doors that were obviously not his room, and eventually setting off a security alarm when he tried to force his way into what he thought was his room, but was actually a supply closet. Hotel security found Robert on what Americans would call the 4th floor, exhausted and slightly panicked, insisting that European elevators were part of some elaborate conspiracy to confuse tourists. The security guard patiently explained that European ground floors don't count as the 1st floor, so Robert's 2nd floor room was actually accessed by pressing the button marked 1 inch in the elevator. Robert's response to this revelation was to spend the next day taking photos of every elevator button panel he encountered, creating what he called his European Elevator Documentation Project to help other confused Americans. He actually created a whole photo album titled "Buttons That Don't Mean What You Think They Mean." But perhaps the most endearing travel fail comes from Betty and Frank, married 63 years, who decided to take their first cruise to celebrate their anniversary. These two had driven across America multiple times, navigated international flights, and successfully raised 4 children. So how hard could a cruise be? The adventure started when they packed for what they thought would be a casual week-long vacation. Neither Betty nor Frank had researched cruise dress codes, formal nights, or the fact that cruise ships are basically floating cities with restaurants fancier than anything in their hometown. They packed like they were going camping, with Frank bringing exactly 1 pair of pants that weren't jeans and Betty packing hiking boots as her dressy shoes. Their first formal night was legendary. While other passengers wore elegant gowns and tuxedos, Betty and Frank showed up to the captain's dinner in matching tourist t-shirts, cargo shorts, and the aforementioned hiking boots. They were completely oblivious to the dress code until another passenger gently mentioned they might want to check their daily schedule for clothing suggestions. Instead of being embarrassed, Betty and Frank decided to lean into their fashion faux pas. They spent the rest of the cruise deliberately dressing as differently as possible from everyone else, turning their wardrobe mistakes into entertainment for their fellow passengers. By the end of the week, they had become minor cruise celebrities, with other passengers requesting photos with the most authentic travelers on the ship. Frank later said it was the best vacation they'd ever taken because they accidentally discovered that being yourself, even when yourself is completely wrong for the situation, can be way more fun than trying to fit in. The captain actually presented them with a special certificate for Best Original Interpretation of Cruise Fashion during the farewell ceremony. What makes these stories absolutely perfect isn't just their humor. It's the fact that every single one of these travelers handled their mishaps with grace, humor, and the kind of perspective that only comes with decades of life experience. They turned potential disasters into memories they'll treasure forever. So next time you're planning a trip, remember Margaret's currency confusion, Harold's GPS adventure, Dorothy's linguistic mix-ups, Robert's elevator mysteries, and Betty and Frank's fashion rebellion. Pack your sense of humor along with your passport, because the best travel stories aren't about everything going perfectly, they're about everything going wonderfully wrong. What's your most ridiculous travel fail? Share it in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove growing older means growing bolder, even when it means growing more confused about European elevators.